My name is Brenna, and I just turned 67 last week. After 40 years of building a life with my late husband Walter, I never imagined spending my birthday alone, forgotten by my 2 children. That evening I sent a simple text saying I miss them. The response from my son Jackson shattered my heart. "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." His wife Stephanie even liked the message. So I blocked them all and cut off their access to the family fortune they had been freely spending for years. The next day, I woke up to 109 missed calls. Before I tell you what happened next, where are you watching from? Hit like and subscribe to see how I turned this heartbreak into the greatest lesson they ever learned. I spent most of my life as a corporate attorney in Boston, meeting Walter during a contentious merger case when I was 25. He was 30 already, making his mark in real estate development. We fell in love over legal documents and late-night strategy sessions. Walter had vision and drive while I had the legal expertise to structure his increasingly ambitious projects. Together, we built a fortune that exceeded our wildest dreams. We waited until our careers were established before having children. Jackson came when I was 35, followed by Audrey at 39. Despite our demanding careers, we made family our priority. Walter coached Little League on weekends, and I never missed a school play or parent conference. We lived comfortably but modestly in a New England colonial in Brookline, wanting our children to understand the value of money and hard work. Jackson was always the sensitive one, artistic and thoughtful, writing poetry, even as a teenager. Audrey was our firecracker, practical and determined, organizing her toys by color and planning her college applications in middle school. They were different but equally loved. Walter and I established education trusts, making it clear that while we would provide every advantage our children would need to find their own paths. Jackson attended art school before discovering his talent for architectural design. Audrey pursued business, joining a tech startup and quickly advancing to management. Our family traditions were simple but meaningful. Sunday dinners were mandatory, with phones banned and conversations flowing freely. Summer vacations meant 2 weeks at our modest Cape Cod cottage, collecting seashells and building sandcastles. Christmas Eve featured homemade clam chowder and attending midnight service at the local Episcopal church. Everything changed when Jackson met Stephanie during his senior year of college. She was striking with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and an infectious laugh. Initially, she charmed us all, especially Walter, who loved her stories about growing up on a farm in Vermont. She seemed genuinely interested in our family history and Walter's business insights. The wedding was beautiful but unexpectedly lavish. Stephanie had a vision involving a historic estate, 6 bridesmaids in custom gowns, and imported flowers that cost more than our first house. Walter and I exchanged glances at the growing bills but said nothing. It was their special day after all. After marriage, Jackson began working at his father's company, showing real talent for architectural repurposing of historic buildings. Their first child, Liam, arrived a year later, followed by Emma 3 years after. I treasured becoming a grandmother, spending afternoons baking cookies and reading the same stories I had once read to their father. The shift began so gradually that I barely noticed. Stephanie started commenting on their starter home, though it was a 4-bedroom colonial in an excellent school district. Jackson began mentioning colleagues with vacation homes and boats. Weekend family dinners were increasingly rescheduled due to social engagements with influential people. Walter tried discussing financial planning with them several times. "Building wealth takes patience," he would say. Jackson would nod while Stephanie would smile tightly and change the subject. They began purchasing luxury vehicles, joining exclusive clubs, and renovating their already beautiful home. When Walter was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it progressed cruelly fast. 6 months from diagnosis to his funeral on a rainy April morning 5 years ago. During his final weeks, he updated his will and trusts, confiding in me his concerns about Jackson and Stephanie's spending habits. "They don't understand what it took to build this," he whispered one night, his once powerful frame now diminished. "Promise me you'll help them learn." I promised, not realizing how difficult that promise would become. After Walter's passing, Jackson and Stephanie's spending accelerated. They sold their home and purchased a 7,000-square-foot mansion in Wellesley. Luxury cars appeared in their driveway. Stephanie began posting photos from exotic vacations and charity galas where tables cost $20,000. Audrey noticed it too. "Mom, have you seen their new boat?" she asked during one of our weekly lunches. "They named it Family Fortune, for God's sake." She had inherited her father's business acumen, and my pragmatism living well, but sensibly with her husband Thomas and their son Noah. I tried gentle conversations with Jackson about financial responsibility. "We just want to give the kids the best," he would say, his father's cautious approach seemingly forgotten. Dad would have wanted that. But Walter had wanted his grandchildren to understand values, not just have valuable things. The grandchildren who once eagerly awaited our baking sessions now seemed distracted, constantly checking their latest devices. Liam, now 10, barely looked up from his gaming system during visits. Emma, at 7, had already developed a concerning interest in designer labels. Stephanie became the family social director, planning elaborate holiday gatherings that felt more like networking events than family celebrations. I began to feel like a guest, rather than the matriarch, in what had once been my own family traditions. Still, I tried to maintain our connection. I attended every school performance, and sports games sent thoughtful gifts, and kept Sunday dinners on the calendar even as attendance became increasingly sporadic. I told myself that families evolve, that I needed to adapt rather than resist the changes that came with a new generation taking the lead. But as Walter's absence grew into years rather than months, I couldn't ignore the growing distance. The children who had once called me daily now went weeks without responding to my messages. The grandchildren who had snuggled on my lap for stories now offered perfunctory hugs before disappearing to their devices. And the family fortune that Walter and I had built with decades of careful work was being depleted at an alarming rate. 3 years after Walter's passing, the invitations to family events became less frequent. Jackson and Stephanie hosted a lavish 4th of July party at their home, complete with catered barbecue and professional fireworks. I learned about it through a mutual friend who assumed I would be there. When I called Jackson, he seemed flustered. "Oh, we thought you wouldn't enjoy it, Mom. It's going to be loud. Lots of people you don't know." I assured him I could handle a party, having hosted hundreds during Walter's business career. An invitation arrived via text the next day, clearly an afterthought. At the party, I found myself seated at a table with strangers far from Jackson and Stephanie, who were busy networking with what I later learned were potential investors for a side business venture. Liam and Emma appeared briefly, accepted the presents I brought, then disappeared with their cousins. I left early, telling no one. Our weekly Sunday dinners became monthly, then quarterly occurrences. Each time the excuses grew more elaborate: sports tournaments, business trips, social obligations that couldn't be rescheduled. I began spending more time volunteering at the hospital, where Walter had received treatment, finding purpose in comforting families going through similar ordeals. The Christmas after that 4th of July remains particularly vivid in my memory. I arrived at the agreed-upon time of 2 o'clock, gifts carefully wrapped, and a homemade bûche de Noël that had been Walter's favorite. Stephanie opened the door in a stunning red cocktail dress, surprise evident on her face. "Brenna, we thought you weren't coming. We moved lunch earlier since the Morgans invited us for drinks at 4. Behind her, I could see the dining room table cleared except for dessert plates with remnants of the meal. Jackson emerged from the kitchen, at least having the grace to look embarrassed. "Sorry, Mom. There was a miscommunication. But there's plenty of food left." I accepted a plate of lukewarm turkey and sat alone at the cleared table while the family bustled around, already preparing to leave for their next engagement. My carefully selected gifts were opened hurriedly with distracted thanks. The bûche de Noël was admired but left untouched as they rushed out, promising to call later. No one did. The grandchildren's distance hurt most deeply. Liam, now 12, had once been fascinated by my stories of landmark legal cases. Now he barely looked up from his phone when I visited. Emma, 9, used to beg me to brush and style her hair. Now she informed me that my fashion sense was totally ancient and asked for cash instead of the thoughtfully selected gifts I brought. Stephanie's comments became increasingly pointed. "That cardigan is so classic," she would say, emphasizing the last word in a way that clearly meant outdated. "Have you thought about refreshing your hairstyle? I know a wonderful colorist who could take care of that gray." I had never been particularly vain, but these constant remarks chipped away at my self-confidence. I found myself spending more time in front of the mirror before family visits, then berating myself for caring what my daughter-in-law thought of my appearance. Jackson's behavior shifted too. Where he once sought my legal and life advice, he now dismissed my input with barely concealed impatience. Things are different now, Mom. Business moves faster. Dad's approach was too conservative. When I mentioned noticing large withdrawals from the family business accounts that I still monitored as a trustee, his response was defensive and sharp. I'm expanding the business in ways Dad never had the vision to try. If you don't understand the investments, maybe it's time to step back from the financial oversight. That suggestion sent a chill through me. Walter had been explicit that I should maintain involvement in the financial decisions until I felt Jackson was ready for full control. Based on what I was seeing, that time had not yet arrived. My oldest friend Patricia noticed the change in my demeanor during our monthly lunch dates. You never talk about the grandkids anymore, she observed over martinis at our favorite restaurant. And you look tired, Brenna. I made excuses at first, unwilling to admit how isolated I'd become from my own family. But Patricia had known me for 40 years, since our first day of law school. She wasn't easily fooled. They're just busy, I insisted. Young families have their own lives. Busy people make time for what matters. Patricia countered her decades as a family court judge, evident in her no-nonsense assessment. Something else is going on. Other friends began asking similar questions. My sister Jean, during her annual visit from Chicago, was more direct. They're using you for your money while pushing you to the sidelines. Walter would be furious. I defended them even as doubt crept in. They were still grieving Walter in their own way. Jackson had lost his father and mentor. Perhaps the spending was a response to grief, an attempt to find happiness in material things, when what they really missed was their father's presence. My volunteer work became my main social outlet and source of purpose. 3 days a week, I counseled families navigating the same medical nightmare we had endured with Walter. The gratitude in their eyes filled some of the emptiness left by my family's distance. Still coming home to my empty house grew harder. Walter and I had purchased our dream home after the children left for college, a beautiful federal-style house with a garden I tended personally. Now its 5 bedrooms and formal dining room designed for family gatherings felt excessive and lonely. I considered downsizing but couldn't bear to leave the last home Walter and I had shared. My 70th birthday approached, and I allowed myself to hope. Surely a milestone birthday would merit a family celebration. I dropped hints during my increasingly rare conversations with Jackson and sent photos of a family vacation in Cape Cod to both children, writing such wonderful memories. Looking forward to making more this summer. No response came from either child. The morning of my 67th birthday dawned bright and clear. I woke early, a lifetime habit from decades of court preparations, and found myself listening for the phone. Surely today would bring calls and perhaps visits. I made coffee and carried it to the sunroom, checking my phone every few minutes. By noon, the silence had become oppressive. I checked my email, finding promotions and a birthday discount from a department store, but nothing from my children or grandchildren. Perhaps they were planning a surprise, I reasoned. I should make myself presentable. I showered and styled my hair, applied makeup, and put on a new blouse I had purchased specifically for the occasion, a deep blue that Walter always said brought out my eyes. The mail arrived at 2. I hurried to the box, finding bills and advertisements, but no cards with familiar handwriting. Back inside, I checked my phone again. Nothing. By 4, I admitted to myself that they had forgotten. Not just Jackson and Stephanie, but Audrey too, my practical, thoughtful daughter who had never missed a birthday or anniversary. Even the grandchildren, who at least had the excuse of youth, had sent nothing. I thought of calling them, but pride held me back. Did I really want to remind my own children of my birthday, to essentially beg for acknowledgement? Instead, I drove to the local bakery and purchased a small lemon cake, my favorite. The young woman at the counter asked if I wanted a message written on top. "Happy birthday," I said after a pause. Just that. "And should I add a name?" she asked kindly. "No," I replied. "Just happy birthday is fine." At home, I placed a single candle in the center of the cake. Tears blurred my vision as I remembered birthdays past. Walter singing off-key as he carried breakfast to our bed. Jackson and Audrey as children presenting handmade cards with wobbly letters and too much glitter. Family dinners with off-key singing, and Walter's insistence on taking dozens of photos that I now treasured. I took a photo of my solitary cake and nearly sent it to Patricia, then decided against it. I didn't want pity, even from my dearest friend. Instead, I made a cup of tea, cut a small slice of cake, and carried both to the garden Walter had designed for our anniversary 15 years earlier. The roses were blooming, just as he had planned, sequential varieties that ensured color from spring through fall. Sitting on the stone bench inscribed with our wedding date, I allowed myself to cry brief and controlled tears that I wiped away quickly. By evening, the silence of my phone became unbearable. After dinner, a simple affair I could barely taste, I composed a text message to both my children. I wrote and deleted multiple versions, not wanting to sound accusatory or self-pitying. Finally, I settled on missing you all today on my birthday. Would love to hear your voices when you have a moment. I hesitated before pressing send, feeling oddly vulnerable. Then I reminded myself that these were my children, not strangers. Surely a gentle reminder was acceptable. For 37 minutes I watched my phone, the message showing as delivered, but not read. Then finally the status changed to read for Jackson's phone. I waited for the 3 dots, indicating he was typing a response, anticipation, and hope rising. When his message appeared, I stared in disbelief. "We need space from you. Please don't reach out anymore at all." As I struggled to process those words, another notification appeared. Stephanie had liked his message. My hand trembled so badly, I dropped the phone. It clattered onto the hardwood floor. Walter had installed himself, proud of his craftsmanship, even after his business success would have allowed him to hire professionals for such tasks. A strange pressure built in my chest, not quite pain, but a crushing sensation that made breathing difficult. I reached for the phone, needing to see the words again to confirm I hadn't imagined their cruelty. No, the message remained unchanged. My son, the boy I had carried inside me for 9 months, nursed through nights of colic, supported through childhood asthma and teenage heartbreaks, was telling me he wanted no contact, and his wife approved. I walked unsteadily to Walter's study, maintained exactly as he had left it 5 years earlier. His presence felt stronger here among his books and collected mementos. I sank into his leather chair and let the tears come freely, now harsh sobs that hurt my throat and chest. What had I done to deserve such rejection? Had I been too involved or not involved enough? Had my grief for Walter somehow alienated my children? I replayed recent interactions, searching for the offense that had led to this banishment. Hours passed as I moved from shock to hurt to a creeping anger. Through swollen eyes, I looked at the family photos arranged carefully on Walter's desk. Jackson's high school graduation, Audrey's wedding. 4 generations gathered for Emma's christening. I pulled out albums documenting decades of family life. The house I had maintained, despite Walter's suggestions to downsize after his diagnosis specifically, so there would always be room for grandchildren to visit and stay. The college tuitions we had paid in full. The startup funds for Jackson's first architectural projects. The down payment assistance for both children's first homes. Not once had Walter and I asked for anything in return except love and basic respect. And now I was being told not to reach out anymore at all. Around midnight, I called Patricia. Despite the hour, she answered on the second ring. "What's wrong?" she asked immediately, knowing I wouldn't call so late without reason. I couldn't speak at first, then the words tumbled out along with fresh tears. I read her Jackson's text verbatim. "That ungrateful little shit," Patricia said, her judicial demeanor temporarily abandoned. "And on your birthday, Brenna, this is beyond unacceptable." "What did I do wrong?" I asked, hating the weakness in my voice. "Nothing," she said firmly. "This isn't about you. It's about them and their apparent belief that they can treat you like an ATM while ignoring your feelings." "What does Audrey say?" I admitted I hadn't heard from Audrey either, though she hadn't responded to my text with explicit rejection. "Walter wouldn't stand for this," Patricia said after a long pause. "You know that, right? He would have consequences for this behavior." Her words echoed in my mind long after we hung up. Walter wouldn't stand for this, and he had made me promise to help them learn. Perhaps it was time for a different kind of lesson than I had intended. I slept fitfully dreams, filled with Walter's voice and fragments of conversations we'd had during his final days. By dawn, something had shifted within me. The crushing pain remained, but alongside it grew a steely resolve I recognized from my courtroom days. If Jackson and Stephanie wanted space, I would give it to them, but on my terms. I showered and dressed with purpose, selecting a tailored charcoal suit I once wore for high-stakes negotiations. I made a list of calls to make appointments to schedule decisions to execute. My first call was to Jonathan Berkeley, the family attorney who had been a close friend of Walter's since law school. His assistant initially told me he was booked solid, but when I identified myself, she immediately put me through. "Brenna," he said warmly, "it's been too long. What can I do for you?" "I need to meet today," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "It concerns the family trusts and Walter's estate." Something in my tone must have conveyed urgency. "I'll clear my 11 o'clock. Will that work?" 3 hours later, I sat in his wood-paneled office, hands folded in my lap to prevent them from shaking as I recounted the events of the previous day. Jonathan's expression darkened as I read Jackson's text from my phone. "This is unexpected," he said carefully. "Jackson has always spoken of you with such respect in our meetings." "When was your last meeting?" I asked. "About 2 months ago. He wanted to discuss accessing more capital for a new development project." I wasn't surprised. "And did you advise him on that?" "I told him any major capital disbursements require your approval as co-trustee until the 10th anniversary of Walter's passing. That was Walter's explicit instruction." "And how did he respond?" Jonathan hesitated. He was disappointed. "He mentioned speaking to you about potentially stepping back from financial oversight." "Just as I suspected. I'd like to review the complete structure of the family finances and trusts," I said. "Every account, every property, every business interest." For the next 2 hours, Jonathan walked me through the complex financial architecture Walter had designed. The main family trust, the business holdings, the grandchildren's education trusts, the various properties and investments. Most importantly, the specific provisions Walter had included about financial responsibility and stewardship. What emerged was a clearer picture than I'd had before. Jackson and Stephanie were almost entirely dependent on family money, drawing substantial monthly distributions while contributing little to the family businesses they technically co-managed. Their personal savings were minimal despite their high income, suggesting their lifestyle consumed everything and more. "There's something else you should know," Jonathan said reluctantly. "Jackson came to me last month asking about accessing the grandchildren's education trusts for a real estate opportunity that he claimed would ultimately benefit them more than the reserved education funds." My breath caught. "What did you tell him?" "That it was impossible without your signature, which would violate the terms of the trust." He wasn't happy with that answer. "Did you inform me of this request at the time?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Jackson assured me he would discuss it with you directly." Jonathan looked genuinely troubled. "I see now that he didn't." I thanked him for his candor, then outlined what I wanted to do next. As I spoke, his eyebrows rose, but he nodded slowly. "It's within your legal rights as co-trustee," he confirmed. "Walter gave you this authority specifically for situations where you felt the family's financial future was at risk. I can have the paperwork ready by close of business today." My next appointment was with David Linden, our family financial advisor. His reaction to Jackson's text was less measured than Jonathan's. "Absolutely unacceptable," he said, genuine anger flashing across his usually calm features. "After everything you and Walter did for them." I explained my plan, and he immediately began accessing accounts on his computer. "You should know," he said without looking up, "that there have been several large withdrawals from the family business account over the past 3 months. Nothing that required your approval individually, but cumulatively substantial." "How substantial?" He named a figure that made me inhale sharply. "All authorized by Jackson for business expenses, but minimal documentation provided." For the next hour, we systematically changed access codes and permissions across dozens of accounts. Monthly distributions were suspended. Credit cards linked to family accounts were deactivated. The grandchildren's education trusts were secured with additional protections, ensuring the funds could only be used for their intended purpose. "This will certainly get their attention," David observed as we finished. "That's the intention," I replied. Back at home, I sat at Walter's desk and drafted a brief, clear email to both Jackson and Stephanie. "As requested, I am giving you space. Effective immediately, your access to family funds has been restricted. Monthly distributions have been suspended. Company credit cards have been deactivated. This arrangement will continue until we have a formal family meeting with legal representation present. The grandchildren's education trusts remain intact, but have additional protections to ensure they are used exclusively for education. This is not done out of malice, but out of respect for your wishes and Walter's explicit instructions regarding family financial responsibility. When you are ready to discuss this situation respectfully, contact Jonathan Berkeley to arrange a meeting. Brenna. I read it twice, making sure the tone was professional rather than emotional. Then I pressed send, immediately blocking their numbers and social media accounts before I could receive any responses. A wave of emotion threatened to overwhelm me as the finality of my actions sank in. I reminded myself of Walter's words during our last conversation about the children: love them enough to let them face consequences. Patricia arrived at 7 with takeout from our favorite Italian restaurant and a bottle of Walter's preferred Barolo. "I'm proud of you," she said, raising her glass after I recounted the day's actions. Walter would be too. "It doesn't feel like a victory," I admitted, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to me. "It's not supposed to," she replied gently. "It's a necessary pain, like setting a broken bone. But you've taken back your power, Brenna. That counts for something." That night, for the first time since Walter's passing, I slept in the center of our king-sized bed rather than on my side. It felt like a small reclamation of self, an acknowledgement that I was still here, still capable, still worthy of respect. I slept deeply and dreamlessly until dawn. The next morning I woke to the sound of my landline ringing. I had forgotten to unplug it in my systematic communication shutdown. The answering machine picked up, and I heard Jackson's voice, tense and controlled. "Mom, we need to talk immediately. Call me back." Before the message finished, the phone rang again and again. I unplugged it after the 5th call. When I checked my cell phone, I found 109 missed calls, 78 from Jackson, 23 from Stephanie, and 8 from numbers I didn't recognize. 34 voicemails filled my inbox, and dozens of text messages demanded my attention. I listened to several voicemails, noting the progression from demanding to pleading. "This is completely inappropriate. Call me immediately." "Mom, whatever you think I did, this is an extreme overreaction. Please call back. We can't access any accounts and we have financial obligations. The credit cards aren't working. This is embarrassing, Mom. Please, we need to talk. I don't understand what's happening." I deleted the rest without listening. Following my attorney's advice, I preserved all messages and documented everything, but I refused to engage directly. Mid-morning, my home security system alerted me to movement at the front door. On the camera feed, I saw Jackson's Mercedes in the driveway. He was at the door, pressing the doorbell repeatedly, then pounding with his fist when I didn't answer. "Mom, I know you're in there. We need to talk right now." I watched silently through the security feed as his face grew redder, his composure slipping. After 15 minutes of unanswered knocking and calling, he returned to his car, slamming the door hard enough that the sound carried through my closed windows. That afternoon, Patricia called to warn me that Stephanie had posted a vague but clearly targeted message on social media. Shocked and heartbroken by the actions of someone we trusted, families should support each other, not tear each other down. The post had already generated dozens of sympathetic comments and concerned messages from mutual acquaintances. I asked Patricia to take screenshots, but otherwise ignored the attempted public shaming. Throughout the day, my phone continued to explode with messages. Friends called asking what was happening. Even acquaintances I hadn't spoken with in months reached out, clearly having heard something from Jackson or Stephanie's camp. To each I responded with a simple, dignified explanation. "We're experiencing a family disagreement that I hope will be resolved soon. I appreciate your concern but prefer not to discuss the details." By evening, Jonathan called to inform me that Jackson had contacted him demanding an emergency meeting and threatening legal action. I explained that everything you've done is within your legal rights, as co-trustee Jonathan assured me. I also reminded him that litigating this matter would be expensive, time-consuming, and ultimately futile, given the clear language in Walter's documents. And his response, I asked. He requested a meeting with all parties present as soon as possible. I suggested next week to give everyone time to cool down. I agreed to the timeline, feeling oddly calm despite the chaos I'd unleashed. For the first time in years, I felt I was honoring Walter's wishes, rather than simply missing his presence. The next day brought a new development. My sister Jean called from Chicago, concern evident in her voice. "Jackson called me," she said without preamble. "He's suggesting you might be experiencing cognitive decline and making irrational financial decisions. He asked if I've noticed any changes in your behavior." The calculated nature of this approach ignited a fresh anger. "And what did you tell him?" "That his father would be ashamed of his behavior, and that if anyone's judgment was impaired, it wasn't yours," Jean replied with characteristic directness. "I also suggested he should be grateful you hadn't written him out of the will entirely after that text message." She paused. "Are you okay, Brenna?" "Really?" "I'm hurt," I admitted, "but also clearer than I've been in years." Several other family members called with similar reports. Jackson was systematically contacting relatives, friends, even former colleagues, suggesting I might be mentally unstable. It was a calculated attempt to undermine my credibility and gain sympathy for his position. In response, I scheduled an appointment with my physician for a complete cognitive assessment securing documentation of my excellent mental health. I also met with a different attorney to update my will not to disinherit my children, but to add specific provisions about financial responsibility and respect. A week into the standoff, I received an unexpected email from Liam, my 15-year-old grandson. My heart raced as I opened it. "Grandma, what's happening? Dad won't really explain, but he and Mom are fighting a lot and talking about selling stuff. Are you okay? Did we do something wrong?" His innocent confusion broke my heart anew. I crafted a careful response. "Dearest Liam, thank you for reaching out. I'm fine, and you and Emma have done absolutely nothing wrong. Your dad and I are having a disagreement about adult matters, but it doesn't change how much I love you both. Your education funds are completely safe and protected for your future. I miss you very much and hope to see you soon. All my love, Grandma." I sent a similar message to Emma after receiving a text from her with a sad face emoji and "miss you, Grandma." Meanwhile, I began hearing reports from mutual friends about changes at Jackson and Stephanie's home. Their housekeeper of 5 years had been let go. A listing for Stephanie's barely used luxury SUV appeared on an online marketplace. Jackson was seen arguing with someone at their country club. The financial reality was setting in. Jonathan called to inform me that Jackson had requested a meeting at the attorney's office, rather than waiting for the scheduled date. "He seems more receptive to discussion now," Jonathan observed carefully. I agreed to move up the meeting, ready to address the situation directly rather than prolonging the standoff. Despite my resolve, I felt a fluttering nervousness as I prepared to face my son and daughter-in-law for the first time since their rejection. The conference room at Berkeley & Associates had witnessed countless family negotiations during Jonathan's 40-year career. Today, it would host perhaps its most personal for him, mediating between me and the son of his oldest friend. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in a navy suit that projected calm authority. Jonathan greeted me with a reassuring smile and a gentle squeeze of my hand. "You've done nothing wrong," he reminded me quietly. "Remember that." Jackson and Stephanie arrived precisely on time. My breath caught at the sight of my son, noting immediately the strain evident in his posture and the dark circles under his eyes. Stephanie's normally immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of distress, her designer outfit noticeably from previous seasons. They entered driving a modest Audi, rather than either of their luxury vehicles, I noted with grim satisfaction. Actions have consequences. Mom, Jackson said, his tone careful but with an underlying tension. He made no move to embrace me, nor did I offer. "Jackson, Stephanie," I acknowledged with a nod. "Thank you for coming." Jonathan guided us to the conference table, strategically seating himself between the opposing sides. A younger attorney I hadn't met sat slightly behind him, presumably to take notes. "Before we begin," Jonathan said, "I want to remind everyone that our goal today is resolution, not recrimination. We're here to find a path forward that respects everyone's interests." Jackson leaned forward immediately. "With all due respect, Jonathan, it's difficult to discuss respect when my mother has frozen our accounts without warning and cut off access to our family business." "Without warning," I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I believe your text message, 'Please don't reach out anymore at all,' was quite clear. I simply respected your wish for space, which necessarily includes financial space." Stephanie flushed. That was about emotional boundaries, not money. Interesting distinction, I noted calmly. Unfortunately, it wasn't specified at the time, particularly when sent as a response to a message about my forgotten birthday. Jonathan intervened smoothly. Let's focus on the present situation and how to move forward. Brenna has exercised her legal right as co-trustee to temporarily restrict access to family funds due to concerns about financial management. He opened a folder containing documents I recognized from our previous meeting. I have here records of withdrawals from family business accounts totaling just over $800,000 in the past 6 months, all authorized by Jackson with minimal documentation. Jackson shifted uncomfortably. Those were legitimate business expenses for the new development project. The one you attempted to access the grandchildren's education funds to support, I asked quietly. His head snapped up in surprise, then his eyes narrowed at Jonathan. That was a confidential conversation. Between an attorney and the co-trustees of the family assets, Jonathan corrected, which includes your mother. For the next hour, Jonathan methodically outlined the concerning pattern of spending and financial decisions, the excessive personal draws from business accounts, the attempt to access protected trust funds, the lack of business growth despite significant capital investment. With each point, Jackson's defensiveness grew while Stephanie became increasingly silent, her earlier indignation fading. When Jonathan finished his presentation, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Finally, Jackson spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. So your solution is to cut us off completely, to embarrass us publicly when credit cards are declined, to force us to pull Liam from his rowing team because we suddenly can't pay the fees. My solution, I said evenly, is to implement the oversight your father intended when he structured these trusts. He built this fortune through discipline and vision, not impulsive spending and status symbols. Jackson flushed darkly. So now you're questioning my business judgment too. I suppose you think I'm completely incompetent without Dad holding my hand. I think I replied carefully that you've lost sight of the principles that built our family's success. And yes, I question judgment that prioritizes appearance over substance. This is absurd, Jackson snapped, pushing back his chair. Jonathan, I want to discuss having my mother evaluated for competency to serve as trustee. Her behavior is erratic and vindictive. I had anticipated this move. Without speaking, I withdrew a sealed envelope from my portfolio and handed it to Jonathan, who opened it and reviewed its contents. This appears to be a comprehensive neuropsychological evaluation performed 3 days ago, Jonathan said, scanning the documents. It states that Brenna shows no signs of cognitive impairment and demonstrates above-average function in all tested areas. He looked up at Jackson. I don't believe a competency challenge would be productive given this evidence. The fight seemed to drain from Jackson suddenly. He slumped slightly in his chair, looking abruptly younger and vulnerable in a way that tugged at my heart despite everything. What do you want from us, Mom? He asked, genuine confusion in his voice. What's the endgame here? I want what your father wanted, I said, softening my tone. A family that values substance over appearance. Children who understand the responsibility that comes with privilege. Grandchildren who grow up appreciating effort rather than entitlement. I leaned forward, looking directly at my son. I'm proposing 3 conditions for restoring financial access. First, financial counseling for both of you to create sustainable budgets. Second, family therapy to address the communication breakdown that led us here. Third, a gradual restoration of funds tied to demonstrated responsibility. And if we refuse, Jackson challenged, though, with less heat than before. Then the current arrangement continues indefinitely with minimal subsistence funds provided monthly. The choice is yours. Jackson stood abruptly. I need to discuss this privately with my wife. They left the conference room and I exhaled slowly, feeling the emotional toll of the confrontation. You're doing well, Jonathan assured me. Hold your ground. 10 minutes passed before the door opened again, but only Stephanie entered, her expression unreadable. May I speak with you alone, Brenna? She asked, her voice lacking its usual confidence. Jonathan looked to me for confirmation. I nodded, curious about this unexpected development. After Jonathan left, Stephanie sat directly across from me, her perfectly manicured hands clasped tightly on the table. Jackson doesn't know I'm talking to you, she began, her voice low. He's calling his sister for advice. I waited silently, giving her space to continue. "I want to apologize," she said the words, seeming to cost her considerable effort. "For liking that text, for the distance, for everything." Surprise must have shown on my face because she continued quickly. "It wasn't Jackson's idea to pull away from you. It was mine." "Why?" I asked, the hurt freshly raw. "Because you watched us too closely," she admitted, unable to meet my eyes. "You saw through the image we were creating. And, because the more involved you were, the less control I had over the family finances." The brutal honesty stunned me momentarily. "You encouraged my son to cut off his mother for money?" "Not just money," she said quickly. "Status. The life I thought we deserved. The life I never had growing up." A tear slipped down her cheek, smudging her carefully applied makeup. "My parents weren't wealthy farmers from Vermont. My father was a janitor who drank away half his paycheck. My mother cleaned houses to keep food on the table. I reinvented myself completely in college." This revelation explained so much about her desperation for status symbols and social climbing. "Why tell me this now?" I asked. "Because I'm terrified," she whispered. "We're drowning in debt beyond what you know about. The cards you canceled were the only thing keeping collectors at bay. The development project is failing. And I don't want my children to pay for our mistakes." Before I could respond, the door opened, and Jackson entered, stopping short at the scene before him. "What's going on?" he demanded. Stephanie turned to him, tears flowing freely now. I told her the truth, about my background, about the financial situation. All of it. Jackson's face crumpled, the facade of confidence finally breaking completely. He sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. "We've made such a mess," he said, his voice muffled. "Dad would be so disappointed." "Your father wasn't perfect either," I said, gently reaching across the table to touch his arm. "He made plenty of mistakes, especially early in his career, but he learned from them." Jackson looked up, his eyes red. "I thought I could do everything better, faster, prove myself without his shadow. Instead, I've nearly ruined everything he built." "Nearly," I emphasized. "Nothing is irreversible yet." For the next hour, without attorneys present, my son and daughter-in-law laid bare the full extent of their financial and personal struggles, the competition with peers that drove excessive spending, the insecurities masked by material possessions, the fear of appearing less successful than Walter had been. By the time Jonathan returned, we had reached a tentative agreement. No immediate restoration of full funds, but a structured path forward. Financial counseling would begin immediately. Family therapy sessions would be scheduled weekly. A modest but reasonable monthly allowance would be provided, while Jackson worked with business advisors to salvage what could be saved from his overextended projects. Most importantly, regular family dinners would resume starting that Sunday. As we prepared to leave, Jackson hesitated, then stepped forward to embrace me awkwardly. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered. "For the text, for the birthday, for everything." It wasn't complete healing, but it was a start. 6 months passed, bringing changes both subtle and profound. The weekly therapy sessions with Dr. Marshall proved more valuable than any of us had anticipated. In that neutral space, guided by her gentle but firm questioning, layers of misunderstanding and unspoken expectations began to dissolve. Jackson admitted feeling constant pressure to live up to his father's success, turning to external validation when he felt inadequate. Stephanie revealed how her childhood poverty drove an insatiable need for security through possessions. I acknowledged my own failure to set clear boundaries after Walter's passing, enabling behaviors I should have addressed earlier. The financial counseling was initially more challenging. The first session revealed debts far exceeding even what they had confessed during our confrontation. Credit cards, personal loans, and overextended business commitments had created a precarious financial house of cards. Their financial advisor, Marcus, didn't mince words. "You've been living a champagne lifestyle on a beer budget," he told them bluntly. "That ends now." The beautiful Wellesley mansion was the first casualty sold and replaced with a comfortable but modest colonial closer to my home. Luxury vehicles were traded for practical alternatives. Country club memberships lapsed. Designer wardrobes stopped expanding. Most surprisingly, after the initial shock, these changes brought visible relief, especially to Jackson. "I didn't realize how exhausting it was," he confessed during a private lunch. always maintaining the image, always worried someone would see through it. The grandchildren's adjustment varied. Liam initially resented leaving his prestigious private school for the excellent but less exclusive public high school. But by spring, he had found a new passion in the school's robotics team, spending hours tinkering with components rather than comparing brand names with classmates. Emma adapted more easily, blossoming in her new environment and developing friendships based on shared interests rather than social standing. She began spending Saturday mornings with me in the garden Walter's design, now maintained by our four hands working together. Our Sunday family dinners resumed, phones once again banned from the table. Conversations evolved from cautious small talk to genuine sharing. Laughter returned tentatively at first, then with increasing freedom. The most unexpected development came from Jackson himself. After struggling to downsize his overextended real estate ventures, he discovered a talent for historic home restoration on a smaller scale. Using skills he'd learned at his father's side but abandoned in favor of flashier projects, he began renovating neglected properties in transitional neighborhoods. His first completed project, a Victorian duplex, transformed into affordable housing for healthcare workers, received local recognition. The profit margin was smaller than his previous ventures, but the satisfaction proved greater and more sustainable. Stephanie's transformation came more gradually. The carefully crafted social media presence featuring luxury brands and exclusive events disappeared. She volunteered reluctantly at first at the hospital where I worked part of our agreement for financial restoration. To everyone's surprise, especially her own, she discovered a genuine talent for patient advocacy, particularly for families navigating complex medical systems without resources or connections. "I understand what it's like to feel out of place and overwhelmed," she explained, when I commented on her natural ability to not know the right questions to ask or words to use. By my 68th birthday, the family dynamics had shifted dramatically. Instead of waiting by the phone for calls that never came, I was awakened by grandchildren bearing homemade cards and a breakfast none of us would eat if not obligated by love. Jackson presented me with a hand-restored antique writing desk he'd found at an estate sale, remembered from a casual comment months earlier. Audrey, who had watched the family drama unfold from a careful distance, brought her husband and son to complete our circle. The celebration was simple by previous standards, a backyard barbecue rather than an exclusive restaurant. But the genuine connection made it richer than any extravagant event could have been. My own life expanded beyond family boundaries. The volunteer work that had been my refuge became a rewarding second career. Patricia and I finally took the European trip we'd discussed for decades, but postponed for various reasons. I joined a book club, took up watercolor painting, and even went on a few cautious dates, though none compared to what I'd shared with Walter. The family fortune, now managed with renewed responsibility, stabilized and began growing again. The grandchildren's education trusts remained untouched for their intended purpose. Monthly distributions resumed at reasonable levels, tied to demonstrated financial maturity. Jackson's new business approach, though less flashy, showed consistent returns that would build sustainable wealth over time, just as his father had done. On quiet evenings in the garden, I often felt Walter's presence most strongly, imagining his approval of the difficult but necessary steps I'd taken. The promise I had made to help our children learn had been fulfilled, though not in the way either of us had anticipated. The lessons came at a painful price: a birthday spent alone, a heartbreaking text, the necessity of creating consequences that hurt people I loved. But from that pain came growth that gentle guidance had failed to inspire. I learned that true love sometimes requires difficult boundaries, that financial support without accountability can become a poison rather than a gift, that the legacy we leave isn't measured in dollars, but in values transmitted to the next generation. Jackson learned that his father's methods had wisdom he'd been too impatient to appreciate. That genuine accomplishment brings deeper satisfaction than appearance of success. That making mistakes doesn't define you, but how you recover from them might. Stephanie discovered that reinvention doesn't require rejection of the past, that security comes from within rather than external validation, that her greatest strength was not her ability to project perfection, but her hard-won resilience and adaptability. And the grandchildren, perhaps most importantly, learned that family bonds transcend financial circumstances, That love includes accountability. That privilege comes with responsibility. When the grandchildren visit now, they still bring their devices, but they set them aside without prompting to help in the garden or listen to stories about their grandfather. Liam recently asked for copies of Walter's early business plans, studying them with genuine interest rather than obligation. Emma started a neighborhood produce stand, selling vegetables we grow together, learning basic financial principles through practical application. As we gather for yet another Sunday dinner, I look around the table at these people I love, so deeply flawed and striving, and genuine in ways they never were when pretending perfection. I think about that devastating text message and the painful but necessary awakening it triggered. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give our children is the chance to stand on their own and see us for who we truly are, not just what we can provide. And sometimes saying no is the most loving word in a parent's vocabulary. What about you? Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with people you love? Did it change your relationship for better or worse in the long run? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe to hear more stories from my journey. And don't forget to share with someone who might need encouragement to set their own loving boundaries. Thank you for listening, and remember that it's never too late to rewrite the story of your family relationships.